The Epilepsy Foundation, Northeast New York, especially Miss Erica DiNicola Shear, for coming back again to present. I always enjoy her presentations, and I always learn at least one or two things from what she has to share with us about seizures. So this is a very important topic. You know, we transport kids who are susceptible to seizures, so we need to learn and be on our best game for providing care for those kids. So Erica, welcome back.
Thank you. Is it okay if I take the mic out?
You can.
I like to walk around a little. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me back. I know that this presentation might repeat some information for a lot of you or some of you, but hopefully I will say something new today that I haven't said before. Again, my name is Erica DiNicola Shear. I am the Director of Community Education and Advocacy Coordinator for the Epilepsy Foundation of Northeastern New York. We are a nonprofit located in Albany, but we cover 22 counties in New York State, providing different programs and services, and of course, education. So, oh, thank you. Before I begin, just a really quick disclaimer. The information being presented to you today is based on training programs created by the National Epilepsy Foundation, of which we are an independent affiliate. The first aid procedures are general guidelines to follow if faced with someone having a seizure. The information given in this presentation does not supersede the policies and procedures for appropriate action as mandated by your employer or requested by a parent or guardian, and I will discuss specific examples of that during the presentation. I also need to announce this year that thanks to a sponsorship from Hannaford Supermarkets, all of our school trainings for the 2019-2020 year are free of charge. So thank you to Hannaford. Okay, so today I will be giving you a general overview of what epilepsy and seizures are to once again make sure that we all have a really good basic understanding of these things. And the goals of this presentation are to help you to better recognize the most common seizure types that students might have, know the possible impact that seizures and epilepsy can have on students, know the appropriate first aid response for different types of seizures, understand when a seizure is a medical emergency, or in other words, when should 911 be called, or when does 911 not need to be called. And then I'll also give you some tips for being supportive of students living with epilepsy. So let's start by talking about what a seizure is. Raise your hand if you have a brain. I only saw like half the hands go up, people. That's pretty late. So I start my presentations out with that question because anyone who has a brain can have a seizure. So quite literally, any single one of us in this room is capable of having a seizure. Our brains are made of billions of tiny little nerve cells called neurons that are constantly sending electrical messages to all the other neurons in the brain, all over our body. This is what allows us to think, to process information, for our bodies to do everything that they are able to do. So what can happen sometimes is this normal ongoing electrical activity in the brain can misfire. Or in other words, a group of neurons send out an excess discharge of their electrical activity in a synchronized way. And this is what's happening in the brain when we say that somebody has a seizure. So a really good metaphor for this, imagine that you are out at a restaurant having dinner with friends or family, and there's all the normal chatter of all the other people at the restaurant, all the other tables, and then suddenly a table starts singing happy birthday, right? We have this irregular activity going on, but it's happening in a synchronized way. So you can kind of think about that as a really good example of sort of what's happening in the brain when it has a seizure. So this misfiring of the neurons can occur in just one localized part of the brain. It can occur in the entire brain at once, or it can start in one part of the brain and then spread to more of it or generalize. So depending on where in the brain the seizure activity is occurring and how much of the brain is involved determines what kind of symptom we see when the person has a seizure, whether that be a change in their movement, their sensation, their behavior, or their awareness, or some combination of these things. So this is a really important concept because a lot of people hear the word seizure and automatically think of someone on the ground having a convulsion. But there are many different types of seizures. There are some seizures that don't involve any involuntary bodily movement at all. There are some seizures that don't affect a person's awareness at all. There are seizures where a person could literally be sitting right next to you, totally alert, totally aware, having a seizure, and you might not have any idea that's happening unless they were to tell you that it's happening, because there is no observable symptom of that seizure. So, two important concepts. One, seizures can look very different depending on what type of seizure we're talking about, and even within the same seizure type, and I'll show you examples of that. And while some seizures are incredibly obvious, there are some that are really, really, really subtle. So epilepsy is defined as a chronic neurological condition characterized by a tendency to have recurring, unprovoked seizures. So recurring simply means 2 or more seizures over time. And unprovoked means that there is no acute medical underlying cause that is making a person have a seizure. So, for example, things like drug overdose, alcohol withdrawal, infections of the brain, things where there's a medical issue that's leading the seizure to happen, and once that medical issue is resolved, the person should not continue to have seizures because that was the provoking cause. So when we say unprovoked seizures in epilepsy, basically what we're saying is that the seizures essentially occur at random because the person's brain just has a tendency for them. By the way, if there's any questions during this presentation, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. So part of our education does include dispelling myths or correcting misinformation that people have received at one point or another. So first of all, when you are talking about a person with epilepsy, most of the time seizures are not considered emergencies, meaning you don't need to call 911 every single time a person with epilepsy has a seizure, so long as their seizure is typical for them. And I'll get a little more in depth with this in a minute. Students might not be aware they're having a seizure, and they might not know that it happened after it ends. So there are seizures that affect a person's awareness, and unless someone is there to observe it, they might not have any idea the seizure's happening. So they may not be able to report to you like, oh, I had a seizure right when I got on the bus this morning. Epilepsy is not contagious. It is not a form of mental illness. Thankfully, it's very rare for people to die from seizures or suffer brain damage from seizures. Perhaps some of you heard about Cameron Boyce recently. He was a Disney Channel star who passed away from a seizure. So it does happen, but fortunately, most people living with epilepsy don't have to worry so much about it. It is pretty rare for that to happen. Very importantly, a student cannot swallow his or her tongue during a seizure. How many of you have ever heard this before, that it's possible to swallow your tongue? How many of you were ever told that you should shove something in someone's mouth to keep them from swallowing their tongue? Or to grab onto their tongue with your fingers? I've heard that too. This is a terrible idea because what you're more likely to do is chip their tooth, you can hurt their jaw. Depending on what you're putting into their mouth, they could potentially choke on it or they could aspirate. But this is something that was really widely believed. I recently had an older gentleman tell me at a training that his uncle had seizures growing up, and their family had a designated spoon that they hung in their kitchen that they reserved just for putting in his uncle's mouth when he had seizures. So this is something that really was widely believed and taught as appropriate first aid. But now we know better. So a student will not swallow his or her tongue. The only thing you might be concerned about with the tongue is if they bite their tongue during a convulsive seizure. But all you can do for that is wait for the seizure to end and then get them whatever medical attention is needed. Some updated facts and statistics for you. 1 in 10 people will have a seizure in their lifetime. And this does not just include people with epilepsy, right? So this does include a lot of provoked seizures that I gave a few examples of earlier, but it just goes to show you that you really have no idea when seizure first aid might come in handy. 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime, which is a lot higher than most people realize. 3.4 million Americans are living with epilepsy, which includes around 215,000 people in the state of New York, 470,000 kids under 15 in the US, which is about 26,600 students in New York State. So quite a few, right? 1 in 3 people with epilepsy live with active seizures, which means that they are not able to achieve seizure freedom or seizure control with any of the available treatments for epilepsy. Epilepsy is more common than cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, muscular dystrophy, and MS combined, and it is the 4th most common neurological problem after migraine, stroke, and Alzheimer's. So just further testament to the fact that it is much more common than a lot of people realize. So similar to how autism occurs on a spectrum of severity, you can think of epilepsy in that same sort of light. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have the forms that are uncomplicated. They're well controlled with medication. Often someone just takes their medication at a low dose once or twice a day, and as long as they do, they are seizure free. There are even some individuals who might be able to be weaned off their medication and remain seizure free. And epilepsy really might not be all that impactful on their life because they got it under control very quickly and stopped having the recurring seizures. But on the other side of this spectrum, we have the refractory epilepsy. So this means that they are medically resistant. So these individuals have often tried many different medications at different combinations, at different dosages, and they might try other treatments on top of their medications, and they cannot get their seizures under control. They might reduce the frequency a little bit, but they cannot get their seizures controlled. So toward this end of the spectrum, they can have a lot of difficulties. There can be social, academic, emotional difficulties from their epilepsy, from side effects of their medications. There's higher levels of comorbidities toward this end of the spectrum. For example, 1 in 4 kids with autism also live with epilepsy. There's also comorbidities with cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, developmental disability. So there may be other things going on as well. And depending on how frequent and how severe the seizures are, they can be incredibly debilitating for the person. Can impact their ability to attend regular classes, to later in life be able to work, to drive. So epilepsy can go from being not very impactful to extremely impactful and extremely debilitating. And then of course there's everyone in between. This is an example of an electroencephalogram, which is a test that is used to aid in the diagnosis of epilepsy and the monitoring of epilepsy. It looks at brain activity and is looking for that misfiring of the neurons that we talked about. So that's what's being captured here. So A is showing an example of what normal brain activity can look like. You can see here it's very static, regular, And in B through D, we're seeing this excitation that we talked about. So part of the reason that I always show this is because a moment ago I told you that most of the time in someone who's diagnosed with epilepsy, seizures are not considered emergencies, meaning you don't need to call 911 every time they have a seizure. And this is why. B is showing the seizure activity from what we call a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, which you might know better as a grand mal seizure. And you can see where the seizure is beginning, but you can also see where the seizure is coming to an end. So the reason that most seizures are not emergencies is because the vast majority of the time, a seizure will begin and end on its own after just a few seconds or a few minutes, depending on what type of seizure it is that we're talking about. Okay, seizures are temporary and episodic. So what you'll notice when we go over the first aid response is that really our primary goal of first aid is to keep somebody safe until their seizure comes to its natural conclusion. And we will, of course, go over circumstances where it does become an emergency and you do need to call 911. So there are two categories of seizures. Generalized seizures involve the whole brain, and the two most common types that we'll talk about today are called absence seizures and generalized tonic-clonic, previously called petit mal and grand mal. And the other category are called focal seizures. Now, even some of you who maybe have seen me do this presentation a couple years in a row may remember the term partial seizure, but the terminology has been updated from partial to now being called focal seizures, just so we're all on the same page. So now, focal seizures either are accompanied with an impaired awareness or not, and these symptoms relate to the part of the brain where the seizure is occurring. This unknown onset that you see down here is a category that's reserved for someone who's newly diagnosed when they're still trying to figure out which category to put someone into. Okay, so the first type of seizure we'll review is the absence seizure. This looks like a pause in activity with a blank stare, and there is a brief lapse in awareness that typically will last between 1 and 10 seconds. During that time, in addition to the blank stare, you might see someone blinking, you might see their lips moving a little bit, and after the seizure ends, they just come right back, totally back to their baseline. There's something called a postictal period that occurs after some types of seizures where people have other symptoms like nausea, headache. They might feel a little bit out of it because they're recovering from the seizure, but that doesn't exist with this type of seizure. They just really come right back after a couple seconds of staring. These are also referred to as staring spells. They can occur many times throughout a day. Some kids might only have a couple a day. Others could have a handful a day. There are some kids who have dozens of these in a single day. There are some kids who can have over 100 of these seizures in a single day. And it's very easy to confuse them with things like daydreaming, lack of attention, or ADD, especially in someone who is not diagnosed. So let me show you an example of what this looks like. Okay, so what you're seeing here is this little guy's doing work, and in just a moment he's going to go into an absence seizure. So right here, you see that blank staring, his lips moving a little bit, a couple eye blinks, and after just a few seconds, the seizure's done, he can go right back to what he's doing. You're going to see another example in just a second, right here. So again, some staring, some eye blinks, not so much with the lips that time, but after just a couple seconds, the seizure ends and he can go right back to what he's doing. So I'm often asked, well, how do you tell the difference between someone having absence seizures and a kid just like spacing out, because that's pretty normal for kids to do. And besides looking for those visible clues, like we just saw in that video, the really blank, vacant look in their eyes, and the eye blinking, and the lips moving, the other thing that you can pay attention to is whether or not you can capture somebody's attention. During the time that that child is staring, if you were to say his name or tap him on the shoulder, he would not be able to respond to you. And I have an example of what that looks like as well. So in this video, this girl is already in a seizure when the video begins, and you'll see her mom is talking to her and she just can't respond.
Jordan, 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 you hear Mama? You hear me? Jordan, Jordan, hey, yeah. Did you hit her hand?
But the second the seizure ended, she just was like, oh yeah, what? So in terms of any sort of first aid for an absence seizure, there isn't any formal first aid to provide. It's really about just paying attention to maybe how frequently it's happening, or realizing that if a child is having these seizures and you're trying to speak to them, that they're not getting information in. So you may have to repeat yourself or repeat instructions that you are giving to them. Any questions about this? Yes?
So do these students know what's going on? I mean, do they even know what happened?
So the question was, do the students even like realize that they're having the seizures? And probably early on they might not, but I believe that, you know, after a while they might have some sort of awareness that they've gone from point A to point C, like especially in a conversation, and not know where point B is, you know? Or if suddenly someone's asking them, hey, are you okay, are you okay? You know, they can realize, oh yes, okay, I must have just had a seizure. But very early on, a lot of kids like don't even know what's happening, especially before they're diagnosed. Any other questions about this one? Yes? Is what? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Oh, is a concussion a sort of seizure? A concussion is not a seizure. A very bad concussion could provoke a seizure to happen shortly after, but a concussion in itself is not a seizure. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead to epilepsy or seizures. All right. So the next type of seizure we'll review is a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, again, previously known as a grand mal seizure. But the new terminology actually captures better what happens during the seizure. So generalized, meaning the whole brain is involved. And there's two phases of the seizure. The tonic phase, you can think of the word tonic, like tone or stiffening. So the body stiffens at the onset, and that's when you typically hear some sort of cry out, and they will lose consciousness and typically fall. And then they go into the clonic phase of the seizure, which is the convulsive part of the seizure, where you see rhythmic jerking of arms and legs. Shallow breathing and drooling may occur during this type of seizure. The shallow breathing can be very alarming, of course, but it is a typical symptom that is seen with this type of seizure, and their breathing should return to normal shortly after the seizure ends. They may lose control of their bowel or bladder, so I always recommend that if you know for a fact you have a student who rides with you, who has this type of seizure, and that may happen for them, consider having something like a blanket on the bus. So if that were to happen and they did lose control, you'd have a way to cover the bottom of them, give them some privacy, hopefully even prevent other students from even realizing that this has happened. You might also see, You might also see their skin, nails, lips turning blue. This is again another concerning but typical symptom that is seen with this type of seizure. Once again, their color should return to normal shortly after those convulsions end. This seizure typically will last between 1 and 3 minutes. For some kids, it could be normal for theirs to go a little bit beyond 3 minutes, but as we'll discuss with the first aid, a generalized tonic-clonic seizure should never go beyond 5 minutes. It is always considered an emergency after 5 minutes. This is followed by that postictal state that I talked about earlier, where they may be confused, have a headache, be very tired, sore, have speech difficulty for some period of time following the seizure. And one sort of general concept that is really important to understand about epilepsy is that it is extremely individualized. So no two kids who have the same seizure type or who are diagnosed with epilepsy are going to be affected in exactly the same way by their epilepsy, by their seizure type, and that even comes down to their recovery. Some kids, after 20 or 30 minutes, might feel right as rain and able to do whatever they were going to do. Others might need to sleep it off for a couple hours. Others might truly not feel better for a day or two after they've had a seizure. So it is all very, very unique to each individual. So to provide first aid for a generalized tonic-clonic seizure on the bus, you want to, of course, safely pull over the bus and inform dispatch about what the situation is, what's going on. You want to ease the student to his or her side. Probably going to happen having them lie across the seat, and you want their back against the back of the seat. If there is not room for them there, you may need to get them into the aisle, but again, you want them on their side. The left side is better than their right side because they're less likely to aspirate on their left side, but any side is better than leaving them on their back. So you just want to have them on a flat surface, safe, not going to fall off, on their side. Like inhaling into their lungs, like inhaling if they have saliva in their mouth or if they happen to have some sort of food in their mouth at the time. You don't want them to inhale that into their lungs, and they're less likely to do so on their left side just because of how we are anatomically built. You want to cushion the student's head, so if you have something soft handy to put under their head, that's great. If not, you can simply try to put your hand under their head to make sure it's supported, not hitting the floor, not hitting a leg of the seat, or anything like that. And on that note, you want to try to remove possible hazards. So things like backpacks, lunch boxes that they could be hitting their limbs on and causing injury. If they are in the aisle, again, try your best to make sure that their arms and legs are not hitting against any legs of the seats and causing injury that way. Question?
If they're already sitting up in a wheelchair or a car seat, should we just leave them sitting up if you want to lay flat?
Yes, and I'll discuss that in a moment. Yep, that's a great question. It's very important to stay calm and track the time. So as I mentioned before, the seizure will typically last between 1 and 3 minutes. If the seizure lasts 5 minutes or longer, it is always considered an emergency because studies have shown that after 5 minutes of seizing, the likelihood of that seizure coming to an end, like we saw in that EEG, is reduced dramatically without some sort of medical intervention to get the seizure to stop. So now we're talking about what's considered a prolonged seizure, where a person is at risk for brain damage or possibly worse if it goes on for much too long. So 5 minutes, you call 911. Now, going back to how individualized epilepsy is, there might be a situation where as soon as a student starts having their seizure, you call 911 because it always lasts 5 minutes. Or there could be a situation where if the seizure lasts 2 minutes, you're calling 911 because For that particular student, their seizure usually only lasts 30 seconds. So if it hits 2 minutes, that's already way abnormal for them. We know it's going to go to 5 minutes, so why would we sit there waiting an extra 3 minutes when we can start taking action for them, right? So this kind of individualized information is stuff that should be written on the student's seizure action plan. And hopefully every student who has epilepsy will have a seizure action plan, and that information will be communicated to you if you have a child with epilepsy on your bus, so that you know exactly what to expect for their seizure in terms of how long it typically lasts, and if there's any individualized timing for that student. But as a general rule, 5 minutes is your golden rule. Assuming that the seizure does end after just a couple minutes, as it should, you want to stay with them. You're looking for signs that they are returning to baseline. So are they breathing normally? Is their color returning? Even if they're really out of it and they feel terrible because they've just had a seizure, can you see signs that they are regaining consciousness, that they are becoming reoriented to their surroundings? Of course, follow whatever district policy is in place for seizures. Make sure you know what that is. Any additional instructions you receive from dispatch, and, you know, as I mentioned, any unique instructions for that student based on their seizure action plan, whether that be calling 911 or guardians, or perhaps after the seizure ends, you can continue to your destination safely. Things not to do. Again, nothing goes in the student's mouth. This includes any sort of food, drink, oral medications. This does not include emergency rescue medications. However, the only one that is widely available to students is a rectal depository. So I can tell you right now that you are not going to be permitted to administer that anyway. So if there's any sort of need for that on the bus, the student will typically be assigned an aide or a registered nurse who has to ride the bus with them if it's really so dire that they must have that on the bus. So, but just an FYI that this does exist for emergency situations to try to get a seizure to stop. Don't hold down or restrain the movement of the student. If you restrict this movement, you can cause injury to them because their muscles are going to be very, very tense during this seizure. So I do have an example of this seizure, and this is also going to demonstrate the general first aid. So what we're seeing first is that tonic phase that I mentioned. Her arm is stiffening and going outward as her body stiffens. And then the clonic phase, again, is the convulsive part of the seizure. So this is actually a really good demonstration of the first aid because it's sort of similar to like a bus seat. So they have her on a couch with her back to the back of the couch, which is fine. She's safe. She's not going to fall off. You see the saliva running out of her mouth there, which again is why we need them to be on their side to make sure that they don't choke or inhale that saliva. There's something under her head, supporting her head. Whoever is with her is providing comfort, but not restricting that movement in any way. And of course, nothing went in her mouth. So, sort of the take-home message about generalized tonic-clonic seizures is that although this is probably the most frightening type of seizure that you could encounter, the first aid for it is actually pretty straightforward, as long as you've been given instructions on what to do. Now, in regards to that question about if you have a student who perhaps is in a wheelchair or is strapped in while they are on the bus, it is actually better to keep them strapped in or in the chair, because if you're trying to haul them out of their seat or out of their chair, while they're already having a seizure, you're more likely to injure them that way. So the best thing to do in those situations is to keep them, you know, in whatever seat they're in. If there are straps, you want to keep them fastened, but loosen them to make sure that they're supported but not restricted. You want to make sure that their head is in some sort of position. So again, anything in their mouth can flow out. So if their head's back like this, you know, they're going to have difficulty breathing. Secretions are going to stay in their mouth. So you want to try to get their head downward. And in regards to their limbs hitting any sort of armrest or anything like that, just do your best to pad the chair or whatever seat they're in to make sure that you reduce the risk for injury. Everyone good on that? Yes? So, depending on the situation, the question was if 911 is called, what procedures do they have in responding to seizures? So oftentimes when 911 is called, by the time they get there, the seizure has already finished. So they basically are doing that assessment after the seizure has ended to make sure that the person is returning to baseline, regaining consciousness, etc. If it's a situation where the seizure is going on too long and they've been called, they have their own emergency rescue medications that they would administer to the person to try to get the seizure to stop, and they would transport that person to the hospital. Did you say VNS therapy? So it depends on what the protocol is for the VNS. So just a quick aside about what VNS is. This is called a vagal nerve stimulator. It's a device that some students might have who have epilepsy, where essentially they put a small battery about this big in the chest, and there's wires or leads that wrap around the vagus nerve, and it functions similar to a pacemaker, where it sends a dose of electrical stimulation to the brain at some set interval, the purpose being that by having this regulated electrical stimulation of the brain, it can help control for any abnormal brain activity that leads to seizures. But if someone has this, they will also be given a magnet that can be swiped across the device to manually send out a dose of that electrical stimulation. So, for example, some kids have what we call an aura, where they know a seizure is oncoming, they have some sort of warning sign. So you might swipe when they have their aura to try to abort that oncoming seizure. Or during a seizure, you might swipe to try to reduce the length or severity of that seizure. So if someone has a VNS, there should again be some sort of defined protocol in place for swiping. So it really is individualized for that individual student, whether the bus driver is okay to swipe it, whether EMTs would swipe it when they get there. You know, it's really, really dependent on the plan for that individual. Any other questions right now? Go. So moving into focal seizures, again, this means that only part of the brain is involved with a focal seizure. You can think of it like there's a focal point to where the seizure is happening. So during a focal seizure with awareness, full awareness is maintained. Depending on where in the brain the seizure is occurring, the person might experience rhythmic movements. So for example, it could just be something like their arm rhythmically jerking like this, or a part of their face, or another limb on their body. But it's uncontrolled, and there's nothing that they can do about it but wait for that seizure to stop. But during the time it's happening, they're totally alert and totally aware. It could also cause sensory symptoms, tingling or weakness in part of the body. It can affect their senses and cause them to hear or taste or smell something that's not there, or even have visual distortions. These can cause psychic symptoms, things like deja vu, hallucinations, emotional responses that are not appropriate for what's going on around them, or just some weird feeling that they can't really explain. These typically are very brief, usually a minute or less. They can be confused with other things, including being mistaken for some sort of psychosomatic illness. Because these are so brief and because awareness is maintained, this is a type of seizure that doesn't require any formal first aid. Again, it might just be about taking a note if you happen to see seizures occurring while someone is on the bus. Any questions on these? Focal seizures with an impaired awareness obviously have impaired awareness and an inability to respond. Now that impaired awareness varies slightly from person to person, again, going back to how individualized epilepsy is. So there's some people who during the seizure, if you talk to them, nothing is getting in. There's others who perhaps can hear bits and pieces of what you're saying, but they're still not able to respond to you. This often begins with a blank gaze stare. So what it can look like is someone acting totally normally, and then this sudden shift in their awareness, where suddenly they seem out of it. They seem out of touch with what's going on around them. They seem confused. And this can go on for typically somewhere between 1 to 3 minutes. It can go on for longer with this particular seizure. It might be normal for someone to go up to 5. And other things that you might see during this time are clumsy and disoriented movements. They could be up and walking around aimlessly. You could hear nonsensical speech. Lip smacking is very common, where it looks like they're chewing gum, but they don't have any gum in their mouth. And not so much with kids, but this seizure, just generally with adults, can very easily be mistaken for things like drunkenness or drug abuse, because sometimes the behavior that you see during the seizure can look like something you would expect from someone who is drunk or high. This is followed by a postictal period, similar to the generalized tonic-clonic seizure. And it's important to note that someone could potentially become combative if restrained. Now, this also, unfortunately, is often mistaken for being some sort of intentional aggression caused by the seizure, but it's really not. It's related to that impaired awareness that goes on, and their inability to interpret the intentions of others around them. So let's just say, for example, maybe there's a student on your bus who's having the seizure, they're up and walking down the aisle, and a friend of theirs maybe goes to just grab them by the arm to help them back into their seat. In that moment, with that impaired awareness, the student having the seizure is not able to interpret the intention behind their friend grabbing their arm. So in that moment, they could interpret this as being threatening and essentially respond, push, respond combatively out of what's essentially self-defense, because they don't know what's happening in that moment. So in responding to this seizure, the best thing to do, oh, I forgot I have my little clicker here. The best thing to do is, again, pull the bus over to make sure that it's not moving. So if they are up and walking around, hopefully they're not going to fall over or anything like that. And you really just want to try to keep the situation calm. So you want to speak to them calmly. You can gently direct them away from hazards or stand as a barrier in their way. For example, if they're about to walk up to where the steps are on the bus, someone can just stand in their way and make sure that they're not going to go down the stairs. Typically, someone in a seizure will take the path of least resistance. You want to just stay with them, keep them safe from harm until the seizure ends. There is a timing guideline for this seizure. from the National Epilepsy Foundation. It's if it lasts 5 minutes beyond what is routine for that student, but I'm just going to get straight to my last point and say you should have a seizure action plan that tells you what to expect for the student and how long to time it for before you consider it an emergency. And then once again, you're staying with the student until the seizure ends and until they are alert and aware, and follow whatever district policy is in place, any special instructions on the seizure action plan. So I have a couple examples of this just to show you really quickly. So in this first example, you're going to see what is a very obvious example, I guess I would say, of a focal seizure with impaired awareness. So you can see that she has a very dazed, blank look on her face, very obvious lip smacking that I mentioned, the automatistic or automatisms that she's showing, the behaviors in her hands and her feet, the way that it's moving around, she's bouncing a little bit. So this is sort of a very obvious example of what the seizure can look like. If you saw someone behaving this way, especially after this training, you'd probably say, okay, I am pretty sure this person is having a focal seizure. But I want to compare that to this other example. And this is the exact same seizure type. And you're going to notice it looks very different. So you can see that he looks a little bit out of it, right? Like he looks like he's not really all there. But other than that initial arm movement, he doesn't really have any obvious automatistic behavior. He's not lip smacking, he's not bouncing. He's just sort of being like unresponsive. And even doing what I do, if I saw someone behaving this way, especially a child, my first instinct would probably not be seizure. It would probably be, oh, he looks really tired. He looks really grumpy. He maybe is upset about something and just doesn't feel like being responsive right now. So the reason I show these videos together is because A, it demonstrates what I said earlier about how even the same seizure type can look very different between individuals, but it also demonstrates how some seizures can be very obvious, while some can be a little more subtle and a little bit harder to distinguish. I wonder how long it took that child's family to realize that episodes like this were actually seizures. Any questions about this seizure? Okay. The next two seizures, for the sake of time, I am going to go ahead and show you the videos, the samples, while I discuss them. So these are other seizures that are more typical in children. The first is called an atonic seizure. So I mentioned before with the generalized tonic-clonic, you can think of the word tonic like tone or stiffening. So you can think of atonic as like a lack of tone. So this causes either a head drop, which is what we're seeing in this video, but you can see that the seizure is really quick, and then there's no postictal period. He just comes right back after his head falls forward. So this is one example of an atonic seizure, a head drop. And the other form of this seizure is a full body collapse. So I'm actually just gonna jump ahead a few seconds. So if you keep your eyes on this guy here, when he walks over to this spot on the table, you're gonna see him just drop. And I give that heads up because it's pretty dramatic. So right about here, you're just going to see him drop. So the interesting thing about an atonic seizure, as I already mentioned, is that the seizure itself is extremely brief. and there's no postictal period after. So any first aid that you're providing is not technically for the seizure itself, if that makes sense. It's for whatever injury happened when their head fell forward or they dropped. So you can imagine if someone's sitting on a bus and their head falls forward, they could smack their head on the seat in front of them. If they fall, you know, there's a lot of edges that they could potentially hurt themselves on. So it would be more about responding to any injury that occurs from that. The other type of seizure that is pretty common in kids, and I'm going to show you this one. This is the most common form of it. These are called myoclonic seizures or myoclonic jerks. They cause contractions of muscles in some part of the body on both sides at the same time. So with her, it's her hands. This is the most common form of it. But this is another one where awareness is maintained. So again, there's really no formal first aid you can provide. It might just be more about paying attention, or if you notice that a seizure is happening on the bus, just letting someone know about it so they know how they can keep track of the frequency of the seizures occurring.
So she was aware that she was having seizures, like she knew what was going on?
Yep.
Even as she was trying to eat her ice cream, she knew she was jerking it away?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so reviewing when a seizure is an emergency. If it's the first time someone is having a seizure and they don't have a known history of seizures, then you would treat that as an emergency. The response depends slightly on what type of seizure we're talking about. Just for example, if you notice what you think could be an absence seizure, it wouldn't be a 911 call. It would just be making sure that parents or guardians are aware if there's a concern that these seizures are happening and they're not diagnosed. But of course, convulsive seizures, some of the bigger types of seizures, you would definitely be calling 911. A convulsive seizure lasting longer than 5 minutes, or whatever is defined in the seizure action plan, like we discussed. Repeated seizures without regaining consciousness. This is something called status epilepticus. Basically, if you see someone have a seizure and they have a second seizure immediately following before returning to baseline, that is always an emergency, because in this situation, they could get into a cycle of seizure after seizure after seizure, and this is another situation where they are at risk for brain damage or potentially death if it goes on for much too long. We've had consumers who have gone into status that lasted for hours. They had to be put into a medically induced coma to get their seizures to stop, to try to protect their brain from any further damage. So it is a really, really serious situation. More seizures than usual or a change in type. So just noting if you happen to notice more seizures in someone than they typically have. The change in type. Let's say you have a student who only ever has focal seizures. They've never had a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, and suddenly they're having one on your bus. Just because they have an epilepsy diagnosis does not make that generalized tonic-clonic seizure normal for them if they've never had one before. So you would definitely treat that as an emergency. If the student were injured during the seizure, if they have another diagnosis, like diabetes or pregnancy, where a seizure could be a complication of these things. If a seizure occurred in water, which hopefully will not apply to anyone on a bus. If normal breathing does not resume following the seizure, they're not returning to baseline. Sometimes parents or guardians might want an emergency evaluation every time their child has a seizure. Again, that should be on the seizure action plan. And once again, make sure you follow any definitions or protocols defined by your employer, the healthcare provider, school district, etc. Any questions about these? We already mentioned the aura and postictal stages. I'll just say that not every child has an aura, but if they do, it can be helpful because they can let you know ahead of time a seizure is going to happen, and you can be proactive about making sure the environment is safe. It's important to be aware of seizure triggers, things that can increase the likelihood of someone having a seizure. The number one is Mr. Late medication, which you have nothing to do with, but just, to be aware of. A lot of these other things you can see have to do with general wellness type stuff. So it's just very important for people with epilepsy to take good care of themselves. Some kids may have issues with overheating, which could be an issue on the bus. So if that is a problem for them, sometimes they'll wear a cooling vest to help keep them cool, to try to prevent seizures. These are the treatment options that are available currently for people living with epilepsy. I'm not going to go in depth with any of these right now, but if anyone would like to ask me any questions after we're done about them or come speak to me individually, I'm happy to hang out for a minute after we're done. Other impacts. So even without physical symptoms, epilepsy and seizures can still cause thinking and memory problems. After a seizure, information might need to be repeated to somebody because it can mess with their memory around a seizure event. Medications can cause all kinds of side effects that they could be dealing with. So that could be causing anxiety, depression, behavior issues on the bus, mood changes, things like that. Students with epilepsy are more likely to suffer from low self-esteem and depression. They may be subject to bullying. And the very interesting thing about bullying with kids with epilepsy, I don't know if you noticed on the trigger list, stress and anxiety can be a big trigger for people with epilepsy. So if they are subject to bullying and they're really, really stressed out and anxious about it, that could potentially increase their seizure frequency. So bullying is actually a really big issue if they're having a lot of issues at school with other kids being mean to them or whatever's going on that makes them feel very stressed and anxious. So obviously we always want to nip that in the bud anyway. But of course, not all difficulties are epilepsy related, so it's important not to assume that every challenge someone faces is simply because they have epilepsy. And I will leave you with some tips for supporting students with epilepsy. So just encouraging those positive interactions, once again. If there's anything on their seizure action plan that you need to know about, make sure you have that information. Understand that they might be dealing with side effects of their medications once again, which can contribute to behavior difficulties and things like that sometimes. Try to bolster their self-esteem, communicate with with parents or guardians about seizure activity that you see while they're with you, so that everyone's on the same page about how frequently seizures are occurring. This helps inform whether treatments are actually working, right? If we know how frequently someone's having seizures. The goal, as with any student who does or does not have any other medical condition, is just to help them have a high quality of life, feel safe, etc. And in my opinion, the first step to doing that with someone with epilepsy is simply knowing what to do if they have a seizure, right? Because then hopefully you feel more comfortable when you're with them, they feel safer when they're with you, it eases the minds of parents and guardians. So, we really appreciate being invited in to give you guys this information. So thank you very much. Are there any final questions? Yes. It could. So the question was, if someone has severe seizures, let's say when they're 13, you know, and their brain is still developing, can that affect how their brain matures over time? And the answer is yes. If they're having very severe seizures over time, especially over a long period of their, you know, when they're developing, that can potentially lead to losses in their cognitive function later in life. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Erica. I appreciate that fine presentation. Next, we have unloading at the bus stop, which is our second mandated topic, mandated by SED. And the SPDI is going to be Lisa Williams, who, by the way, for those of you that don't know, Lisa is our new dispatcher. She is replacing the veteran, Jane, back there. So, Jane, in front of everybody, I want to say